today's show, Connor Bedard just delivered the loudest endorsement yet of Andrew Cristall. And if the Capitals prospect pipeline wasn't getting your attention before, it should now.
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. In today's episode, we're talking about Justin Sourdif, who might quietly be becoming one of Chris Patrick's best acquisitions to date. Listen, the Capitals took a gamble. They gave up some draft picks, and now they look like they may have found a long-term answer down the middle. A bit later, we'll talk about the injustice surrounding Jakob Chychrun, because I still cannot believe he received 0 Norris Trophy votes. 26 goals from the blue line, 60 points, massive minutes, yet somehow he wasn't on a single ballot. I'll discuss why Chychrun's season deserves far more respect than it received. But where we will start is, yes, circling back to Andrew Cristall and the ringing endorsement of Connor Bedard, because Connor Bedard just called him one of the best players he's ever played with. And he's dominated at every level. That's not just a nice compliment. That is a statement from one of hockey's biggest stars about a player the Capitals fans hope becomes a core piece of the next era. And that is where we will start in today's show, because I did a profile a couple episodes ago talking about Andrew Cristall and how I think he's, stands to be a big-term answer, long-term answer for the Capitals. And when you get this kind of endorsement from Connor Bedard, these guys have played together for a while, so it's not like he's unfamiliar with the player. But I don't think that Connor Bedard is the kind of player that just heaps out praise on anybody. At the end of the day, when you vouch for someone, you got kind of your reputation at stake. So let's talk about that. The biggest takeaway here is that Connor Bedard's comments matter because they confirm that Andrew Cristall is much closer to becoming an NHL player than many people realize. And, last season I spoke of that. I thought he was right there. I thought there was a distinct possibility he could have made the Capitals out of camp and played on the team the whole season. Well, as it turned out, I think he was best served playing a full season down in Hershey. But, that acknowledgement that he might be NHL ready, maybe the Capitals in the fall, that is the headline. That's the main story. And honestly, that's why the Capitals fans, all of us should be paying attention, because when Bedard was asked about Cristall, it was during their Memorial Cup reunion, he didn't hesitate. He called Cristall one of the best players he's ever played with. Then he followed it up with perhaps the most important statement of all. He said, quote, "He has dominated at every level he's been in," unquote. Again, book it. That is Connor Bedard vouching. That is Connor Bedard singing the praises of Andrew Cristall. So it's not just me. It's not, just the scouts. When you start hearing it from multiple sources, I think you can draw connections in your own mind, because it's funny. I do these profiles, and a couple people on YouTube responded like, "I think they should trade Cristall." That the guy just doesn't get any love. And a lot of it is due why? Because of his size, right? He's a bit shorter in his skating. But he worked on his skating. He bulked up. The only thing he could not address, of course, was how tall he is. We can't fix those kind of things. But I give a lot of credit to Andrew Cristall on the things that he could work on and has addressed those things. But, when Bedard says he has dominated at every level he's been in, that's not media hype. That's not Dan or a scout trying to sell a prospect. That's coming from a player who has spent his entire life around elite hockey talent. And then when you think about it, Bedard is probably uniquely qualified to make that evaluation. He's played, with NHL stars. He's played alongside future NHL stars. And for him to single out Cristall tells you something huge. The reality is Cristall has spent most of his hockey career proving people wrong. And I give so much credit to him because he doesn't pout, he doesn't sulk, he doesn't say, if I was this, I would have been that. No, he works on the things that he can work on and is knocking it out of the park. Number 2 in Hershey in goals last season, because you take a look back when he entered the WHL, people loved the skill, but questioned whether the skating would limit him. Then he produced when he became one of the most productive offensive players in junior hockey. Well, people still focused on what he couldn't do. Then what did he do? I'm going to prove you wrong at every level. He produced more. Eventually, he became the all-time leading scorer in Kelowna Rockets history with, count 'em, 340 points. Think about that. Kelowna has produced NHL players for decades, right? The organization has seen stars come through the system, and yet Andrew Cristall sits at top of their scoring leaderboard, right? That doesn't happen accidentally. And when you ask me, what I find most encouraging is how Cristall talked about his first pro season. He didn't pretend anything was easy. He didn't act like he, immediately stepped into the AHL and dominated, because he didn't. There were questions when he started his season in Hershey. Is this guy really it? Instead, he admitted there were frustrations. He admitted that he faced challenges and admitted that there were moments where things simply weren't working. And, ultimately, that's exactly, what you want to hear from a young player. I don't sell me any BS. And that's the one thing about these young players is they assess themselves very well, right? That they're not like, hey, I think I could join the Capitals next season. A lot of these young players, they're honest. They'll say, no, I got some work to do. Because, every prospect hits a wall. Reaches a point where pure talent is not enough anymore. So the question becomes whether they're willing to adjust. And well, Cristall appears to have done exactly that, because by the end of the season, his confidence had clearly grown, along with his comfort level and understanding, of the pro game, and how it had grown. And perhaps, I would say most importantly, his organization had never stopped believing in him. The Capitals, the Bears, the Capitals knew exactly what they were drafting and who they were drafting. They knew the strengths and weaknesses. And, well, they know that there would be some development. But, they also knew elite offensive instincts are incredibly difficult to teach, right? He did the things, like I've said. And then, it's the intrinsic qualities, the hockey IQ, slowing the play down, seeing plays before they develop. Those are the things that are not easily, or dare I say, impossible to teach. And Cristall possesses those instincts naturally. And you watch him play, and the puck seems to, follow him around if you watch him. And his vision stands out because he sees passing lanes before anybody else. And, his offensive creativity allows him to create opportunities that simply do not exist for most players. And that ultimately is why his junior production numbers were so crazy. Yeah, and what am I talking about? Players, right? They don't accidentally put up 132 points in 57 games or become franchise scoring leaders, right? That just doesn't happen. Players don't accidentally earn praise from guys like Connor Bedard. I don't think he's the kind of guy that wants to vouch for someone and have them be, a complete garbage pile, right? And the more I look at the situation, the more I think Capitals, us fans, need to start preparing for the possibility that Cristall forces his way into the conversation sooner than later. And I'm not saying that because the organization, wants him here. It's because they have no choice. And that's what the best prospects do, is they force the hands of their organization that I am pounding on the door saying, give me an opportunity. Should the Capitals ultimately reward his hard work? That is the question. So to wrap up segment 1 here, Connor Bedard's comments weren't news because they revealed something new. Well, they were new because they reinforced what many already suspected. Andrew Cristall is becoming one of the most important young players in the Caps organization. And if the future looks bright, the present isn't too bad either, because one of the Capitals players just completed the best season of his career and somehow got completely ignored by Norris voters. I'll discuss straight ahead right here. There's nothing like playoff hockey. The intensity, the rivalries, the crowd, it's just different when you're in the building. Playoffs are some of the best moments in sports, and being there in person is something every fan should experience. Game Time makes it incredibly easy to find tickets even for those high-demand playoff games in just a few taps, and with the Game Time guarantee, you know you're getting 100% authentic tickets delivered on time and at the best price. And through the playoffs, and dare I say, even in the Stanley Cup, I've been looking if their tickets are available using the Game Time app. And let me tell you something, there are still some incredible seats available, even for those games that you thought were impossible to get into. The app is super easy to use. You can find tickets fast, and the pricing is all in. So what you see is what you pay, no surprise fees. And one of my favorite features is the seat view. You actually see what your view will look like before you buy, which makes a huge difference. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. Workplace chaos, deadlines stacking up, inbox overflowing, and the one position you have to fill is sitting open. When the pressure's on and you need the right hire, this is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Indeed Sponsored Jobs helps you reach people who actually fit what you're looking for. Skills, experience, location, so you're not just hoping the right candidate stumbles across your post. And here's a stat that says it all to me. In the minute I've been talking to you, companies like yours made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed Worldwide. So if you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with Indeed Sponsored Jobs. So spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Less stress, less time, more results. When you need the right person to cut through the chaos, this is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs, and listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to help your job get the premium status it deserves at Indeed.com/podcast. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast right now and support our show by saying you heard about it on the Locked On Capitals podcast. Need to hire? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Get your Locked On Capitals fix completely ad-free by joining the Everydayer Club. Start your 7-day free trial now and get closer to the Capitals without interruptions. Click the link in the show notes or go to lockedoncapitals.supercast.com to claim your free trial. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So is there no justice in the hockey world? This next story here has me absolutely baffled. And, you know, this kind of goes, is there something around the Capitals that the Capitals players just, you know, receive no love? We think back to the Four Nations face-off and the snubs that went on there. But this is kind of on par with me with the Chychrun snub. What did he, you know, Chychrun to me is the best player defensively in the NHL, and still no love in Norris voting. So let's dive into that in the second segment of today's show, because Chychrun just had the best season of his NHL career. And, well, the fact he received, count 'em, 0 Norris Trophy votes shows you how badly his season was undervalued around the league. And that is an understatement, because I keep coming back to this number and I read it and I reread it, and I'm like, is there some noise in this data? Is there an asterisk? Is there something I'm not reading? Nope, 0. Not one vote. Not one fifth place vote. Nothing. And that's remarkable in a truly bad way, because when you look at the season that Chychrun produced, it becomes harder and harder to justify this complete absence of Norris ballots, because let's talk about the elephant in the room, right? Goals by defensemen, 26 goals. And that led all NHL defensemen, you know, not some of them, that led all of them. Cale Makar didn't score more. Evan Bouchard didn't score more. Zach Werenski didn't score more. Nobody scored more. 26 goals from the blue line. I'm going to call it what it is, elite production. And then you add the 60-point season. Then you add, the increased responsibilities after the Capitals trade Karlsson out. And you add the fact that he has consistently played against top competition. And then you're looking at a player, right, who checked a lot of boxes, but a lot of boxes voters usually care about, but it wasn't good enough. To be clear here, I'm not arguing he should have won. I think he should have won. I like to say I don't want to argue that he should have won, but in a lot of ways that is the elephant in the room. Unless you're not looking at it as goals scored, because we take a look at the other players in there, right? You take a look at Werenski, right? Great year, 81 points, huge minutes. Absolutely deserves some recognition, but that's not the issue. The issue is Chychrun wasn't even acknowledged. So that's the big takeaway here. As a homer, right, I think that Chychrun should have won. But, if you want to look at, different statistics and point to that, that's why I'm saying, maybe just, removing myself from the situation, that he shouldn't maybe have won on goals alone, but he should have at least received some votes, right? I think that makes sense. And I think the part of the reason is perception. For years, Chychrun carried the label of a talented player who couldn't, stay healthy or put everything together consistently. And, when you take a look at it, those labels, kind of stick around, sometimes long after they stop being true. But this past season felt different. This felt like, to me, Chychrun finally arriving, because the Capitals didn't see flashes from him. They saw reliability, and that's exactly what they got. Because what you saw from him on game in, game out basis is he drove the offense, generating scoring chances, scoring, being a scoring threat that opposing teams had to account for. And that's from a blue liner, right? The Capitals desperately needed that dimension, especially after the Karlsson departure, where there was a gaping hole there. The fascinating thing moving forward is that he may actually be getting better. And what do I mean? He's entering what should be his prime years of his career. He's ultimately comfortable wearing a Capitals jersey, right? And he's established himself within the organization. And, for the first time in a long time, he doesn't feel like a player searching for his place. You saw him playing for the Coyotes, and you saw him playing, I'm talking recent memory here, for the Senators. And both of those teams, off the top of my head, do not really stand out as good fits. And I think that he would say as much as well. But the Capitals, for me, removing my Capitals fandom, I think let the numbers speak for themselves, right? So that's where I'm at. When I say that I think he should have won, I do. And I'm looking at that with the goals scored. But, when you remove yourself from the equation, being a Capitals fan, okay, maybe there were other things that the other, people that were up for it, that's the reason that they were chosen. But for not to get one, I'm having a hard time. I'm having a hard time with the Capitals fans, I'm here to tell you. But I think he's found his place within the organization, and which I think is why next season will be fascinating because, ostensibly, unless something crazy here happens, John Karlsson is gone. And the Capitals need some answers from the blue line. They need Chychrun to be the best version of himself. Does he need to put up those same amount of goals? Well, I wouldn't complain about it, but I think if he can be a sound defender and, put up decent goals, then that would be great. But what we need from him is a whole lot more because this is a team in transition, big picture. We could be heading into the post-Ovechkin era, right? And I hate that always lines are drawn to that, but you need the pillars on the team. And I'm putting Jakob Chychrun in that column as one of the pillars. But when you put up those goals that you did this past season, expectations change. Nobody will overlook him internally. The Capitals absolutely know what they have. The question that I have is whether, the rest of the league starts paying attention too, because, like I pointed to, when I'm talking about LT, I'm talking about Tom Wilson, Four Nations and being overlooked in those situations. This kind of feels a little bit similar to me. Different circumstances, I get that. But, another circumstance why I think, the Capitals don't get any love in this situation. Of course, you could then also point to the fact of the Olympics, and that is, a bit of a retracted comment. But in any event, I think that Jakob Chychrun put in the work. The goals speak for themselves, and the very fact that he received 0 votes is a big injustice to me. So to wrap up segment 2 here, Jakob Chychrun deserved far more recognition than he received. I think we can all agree on that. And we can say that the voters may have overlooked him, but the numbers don't lie. And speaking of numbers, there's another Capitals player whose impact extends well beyond the stat sheet. A player who quietly transformed one of the Capitals' biggest weaknesses into a legitimate strength. Let's talk about Justin Sourdif straight ahead, right here. ED is way more common than most guys think. Millions of guys deal with it at some point, and that's exactly why HIMS offers a straightforward way to handle it. HIMS connects you with a licensed healthcare provider online, giving you access to legitimate ED treatments from the comfort of your own home. No awkward appointments, no pharmacy lines, just a straightforward process that makes it easier to take care of yourself. The process is simple. You just complete a quick online intake and a provider reviews your information. If treatment is right for you, it ships directly to your door in discreet packaging, which makes the whole experience feel private and stress-free. To get simple online access to personalized, affordable care for ED, hair loss, weight loss, and more, visit hims.com/LockedOnNHL. That's hims.com/LockedOnNHL for your free online visit. hims.com/LockedOnNHL. Prescription required. See website for details and important safety information. Sildenafil is the generic version of Viagra. Viagra is a registered trademark of Viatris Specialty LLC. HIMS is not affiliated with or endorsed by Viatris. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I want to thank you for making this your first listen of the day and for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. So let's dive into the final segment of today's show. And I don't want this to push this guy to the back burner because I'm calling him a big deal. I'm talking none other than Justin Sourdif. And I'm going to be honest with you. A couple summers ago, when the Capitals traded for, or I guess it was last summer, it's summer now, we're in a transition here. Last summer, when the Capitals traded for and acquired Justin Sourdif, I'm going to be honest with you, you gave up, 2 draft picks to get him. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, 1 draft pick, 2 draft picks. There's got to be something, to this guy that I just don't know. And what we heard is that he has been on the Capitals' radar for a while. And other teams were offering up 1 draft pick. Well, the Capitals wanted to, add a sweetener, so they added 2. And I'm going to be honest with you, not very familiar with him, but, far exceeded my expectations. Was, as a matter of fact, a winger on the 4th line, and then, played center. Played a little bit in the absence of PLD at that center position as well, and far exceeded my expectations. So let's talk about Sourdif here in the final segment of today's show, because Justin Sourdif may have solved, and I think we can all agree, one of the Capitals' biggest long-term problems by giving them legitimate depth down the middle. In yesterday's show, I talked about Ilya Protas as maybe being a part of the long-term answer down the middle. And then there's rumblings out there, right, that Dylan Strome could be expendable. And why is that? Because of the likes of Ilya Protas and Justin Sourdif. Because this is one of these stories talking about Sourdif that doesn't get, enough attention. He's not one of the sexier names in the league yet. Because when Chris Patrick, traded for Justin Sourdif, most of the conversation centered around the cost. The draft picks. For a player with very limited NHL experience, a lot of people were not sure. Some thought it was too much. I questioned it. If you're an everydayer, you know that. Others wanted a more established player. And then you fast forward to today, and the trade looks completely different, right? What stands out to me is Sourdif isn't necessarily just the raw production. That's not what jumps. It is where he where he fits in, the versatility, right? I talked about him playing wing and center, and that willingness and that openness to being adaptable. It's the trust he earned, and it's earned by Spencer Carbery putting his confidence in him. Like, I believe you can be that guy. And there's a lot of coaches that wouldn't put Sourdif in that kind of position. You think back to Peter Laviolette. He always went for the safe veteran. There's a million reasons why I like Spencer Carbery as a coach, but that is one of the other reasons to elevate the players that play underneath of him. And Justin Sourdif is one of those guys because, like I said, when PLD missed significant time, somebody had to step into a bigger role. Sourdif did. When the line combinations adjusted, Sourdif did. And the Capitals needed responsible minutes against quality opponents. Sourdif answered the bell again, and it's not an easy thing for a young player in the league, especially one that is trying to make a name for himself in the NHL, and more specifically the Capitals. Because Carbs repeatedly praised Sourdif's ability to handle responsibility beyond what most players with his experience level would normally receive. And he was rewarded with more responsibility or more opportunity. And number 43, Tom Wilson, is not the kind of guy that heaps out praise that easily either, but he praised the way he embraced difficult assignments. And those aren't, empty, compliments. Like I said, Tom Wilson is not the kind of guy that just hands those out willy-nilly. Those are, I'm going to call them endorsements from people who understand exactly how hard those jobs are. And I think that is why Justin Sourdif matters so much. Championship caliber teams don't just, have star players. They have layers. They have depth, and they have players capable of moving throughout the lineup. That if we need you at center, great. If we need you at wing, that's good as well. And Sourdif gives the Capitals that kind of flexibility, and not just put me in there and I'm going to just play minutes. No, meaningful minutes. So we look at him. Maybe he's your third line center. Maybe he's your fourth line center. Injuries might force him into a top 6 role again. We don't know. The point is he can handle all of those situations, and he proved that, and then some. And that is incredibly important and valuable at the end of the day for this team, because the deeper you look into his game, the more you understand why the Caps targeted him. His skating allows him to pressure opponents consistently, and his work ethic is one of the things that jumped out to me last season. And just his hockey IQ, his hockey sense, helps him stay effective when he's not producing offense. And, I would say even more importantly is he plays a style that Carbery trusts. And that's ultimately how he earned the ice time and the opportunities. And, that trust is ultimately what's going to keep him in the lineup when there's other younger talent, making a case. The Capitals, have a fascinating collection, shall I say, of young forwards. You look at Leonard and Cristall, Protas, McMichael, Sourdif. The future just isn't about one player anymore. It's this wave that we hear about, the next wave. And Sourdif might be one of the most important pieces that we didn't really plan for, because he provides balance to this group, and he has taken to increased responsibilities very well. And, not every prospect is going to become a superstar. I'm not here to tell you that Sourdif is going to be a superstar, but I'm here to tell you he's going to put his work boots on, and he's going to give you his damnedest effort. And, sometimes these players who help teams, win are the ones who makes everyone else's jobs easier. Sourdif, to me, is starting to look like that kind of player. Because, he's the kind of player that, if the Capitals are in contention, in the playoffs next year, you're going to lean on him. And like I said, Carbery loves his style of play. And he's ultimately, if I'm going to summarize him, the kind of player opposing teams hate playing against. That Sourdif has far exceeded, I think, all of our expectations. And I look forward to, in earnest, the steps forward that he takes next season. I think we just seen the tip of the iceberg, and this next young wave of Capitals players has got me the most excited. So to wrap up segment 3 here, Sourdif has gone from intriguing acquisition to an important piece of the Caps' future. Andrew Cristall represents elite offensive upside, and Chychrun represents a cornerstone of the present and future. Sourdif represents the type of depth that winning teams need. And you put them all in a pot together, and you can see what Chris Patrick and the Capitals are building. A roster that can compete today while creating the foundation of this next wave that we keep talking about. And if these developments continue, well, the Capitals may be closer to the next great era than many people realize. It doesn't have to be wandering out in the wilderness for years. The Capitals could hit the ground running in 26-27. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, your only daily year-round podcast covering the Capitals. And I want to thank all of you that listen on the audio side and watch this on YouTube. You, as a matter of fact, are what makes this show successful. And if you're one of those that never miss an episode, let me tell you something. The Everydayer Club is for you. Get Locked On Capitals ad-free plus members-only Discord access and more. Head to lockedoncapitals.supercast.com to join. There is also a link in the show notes. So for those of you on the video side, we send you to the first ever 24/7 national Locked On Podcast Network YouTube channel on audio. Make sure and make your second listen NHL game night on Locked On NHL. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it is your team every day. My name is Dan Holme, and I'll talk to you again next time.